Deep in Cambodia's jungle lies a city so massive it was once home to over 1 million people. But here's the shocking part. One day, they all just vanished. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations. In 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot was hacking through the thick Cambodian jungle, hunting for exotic insects. What he found instead was impossible: massive stone towers rising from the forest floor like something from a dream. He had stumbled upon Angkor Wat, but what he couldn't have known was that he'd discovered just the tip of an iceberg. Hidden beneath the jungle canopy was a lost metropolis the size of modern-day London. A city built by kings who claimed to be living gods. A civilization so advanced they engineered water systems that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 500 years. But if this empire was so powerful, so sophisticated, why did 1 million people abandon paradise and let the jungle swallow it whole? When Henri Mouhot first laid eyes on Angkor Wat in 1860, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just a temple. It was larger than any cathedral in Europe. Its towers, shaped like lotus flowers, had been reaching toward heaven for 900 years. Built a full century before France's famous Chartres Cathedral, Mouhot wrote in his journal, "One of these temples might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome." But here's what's truly mind-blowing. When Mouhot found this architectural masterpiece, only a handful of Buddhist monks lived nearby, and none of them knew who had built it. Local legend said the great temple had built itself. Others claimed it had always existed. Think about that for a moment. A structure more magnificent than anything in the ancient Western world. And its own people had forgotten who created it. Mouhot suspected these temples belonged to a huge, sophisticated civilization, but he had no evidence. The jungle had kept its secrets too well. Tragically, Mouhot would never live to see his suspicions confirmed. Bitten by a poisonous insect, he died in the jungle just 1 year after his incredible discovery. As explorers began stripping away the jungle, they found something remarkable. Inscriptions, not just in ancient Cambodian, but in Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hindu priests. What ancient civilization had flourished here? Then came an astonishing breakthrough. Hidden in Chinese archives was a journal written by a junior Chinese official named Zhou Daguan. In 1296 AD, he had visited this very place on a diplomatic mission and spent 11 months living among the people. His diary described something incredible: a major civilization, a capital city bigger and more developed than archaeologists dared imagine. But for 100 years, scholars dismissed his account as fantasy. How could such a massive city have existed in the middle of a jungle? Zhou described busy streets teeming with life, magnificent palaces, and a population that dwarfed any European city of the time. He wrote of golden towers, elaborate ceremonies, and a king who was worshipped as a living god. For decades, archaeologists took his writings with a grain of salt. After all, he was writing as an educated Chinese man who considered anyone outside the Chinese Empire to be barbarians. His account seemed too fantastic to be true, but what if it wasn't fantasy? What if every word was accurate? The story of Angkor begins with one man whose vision would create an empire. For thousands of years, the indigenous people of Cambodia, the Khmer, had lived as peaceful rice farmers, scattered across small feuding kingdoms. But in 802 AD, everything changed. A charismatic leader named Jayavarman emerged with a radical plan. He ordered all his subjects to abandon their homes in eastern Cambodia and follow him west in a great march across the Mekong River. Having conquered his rivals, he chose a strategic location between sacred hills and a great lake for his new capital. Then he did something unprecedented. He declared himself Jayavarman, the supreme world emperor, the king of kings. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Jayavarman didn't just demand to rule by divine consent. He proclaimed himself to be a living god, deserving of worship from his subjects. This single decision changed the course of Cambodian history forever. Over the next 500 years, Jayavarman's descendants, these self-proclaimed living gods, would build the most extraordinary city the world had ever seen. Each king built his own temple, as both a monument to his glory and his future mausoleum. Since the Khmer practiced Hinduism, each temple was modeled on Mount Meru, the legendary five-peaked mountain home of the Indian gods. For these builder kings, their shrines weren't just religious structures, they were celebrations of religion, art, science, and absolute power all rolled into one. Of all the god kings who ruled from Angkor, none was more ambitious than Jayavarman VII. Ruling between 1181 and 1219 AD, he was known as the Great Builder King, and that title wasn't an exaggeration. This man moved and shaped more stone than every other Angkorian king combined. Think about that. In less than 40 years, one ruler transported and carved more massive stone blocks than all his predecessors and successors put together. Jayavarman VII expanded the empire further than any other Khmer ruler. Under his reign, the borders stretched from southern Vietnam to Laos, from the Mekong River to eastern Thailand. He controlled trade routes, commanded armies, and ruled over millions of subjects. Within the walled city of Angkor Thom, Jayavarman built a palace befitting his mighty empire. Zhou Daguan, our Chinese eyewitness, described audiences with the ruling king. Every time I was admitted to the palace, the king came forward with his chief wife and took his place in the golden window of the main audience hall. But Jayavarman VII's greatest achievement wasn't just building monuments to himself. He constructed roads across his entire kingdom, complete with rest houses built exactly one day's journey apart. He wanted pilgrims to visit his temples, so he created the infrastructure to make it possible. This man must go down in world history as one of the greatest builders of all time. The success of Angkor wasn't built solely on rice and water. The god kings created a sophisticated economy based on international trade that made their empire one of the wealthiest in the medieval world. The Khmer produced far more food than their swelling population could consume, creating a surplus that could be traded with neighboring states. But their exports went far beyond rice. They crafted exquisite textiles, cast enormous bronze statues using advanced metallurgy techniques, and exported luxury goods that were prized across Asia. Angkor's craftsmen worked with ivory from their own elephants, creating intricate carvings that were traded as far away as the Mediterranean. They harvested kingfisher feathers, brilliant blue and orange plumes that were worth their weight in gold, to Chinese emperors who used them to create elaborate headdresses. The kingdom also exported aromatic woods, precious stones, and most importantly, they controlled the trade routes between India and China. Every merchant ship that wanted to avoid the dangerous sea passage around the Malay Peninsula had to travel through Khmer territory, paying taxes and tribute to the god kings. But their most important trading partner was China itself. The relief carvings on the Bayon Temple revealed Chinese trade junks crossing the waters of the Great Lake, their hulls heavy with goods. Archaeological excavations at the royal palace have unearthed considerable quantities of Chinese ceramics, proof of the extensive trade relationship. Zhou Daguan's delegation wasn't the only Chinese presence in Angkor. In fact, Chinese merchants had been settling there for years, drawn by the profitable opportunities in this wealthy kingdom. As Zhou observed, the Chinese always take a wife here as soon as they arrive, deriving additional benefit from the woman's business skills. This last comment reveals something remarkable. About Khmer society, women held positions of power and authority that were unusual for the medieval world. In Cambodia, it was women who took charge of trade. Instead of male-dominated marketplaces, Zhou found that there are no shops in which the merchants live. Instead, they display their goods on matting spread on the ground, and these markets were run by women. Women in Angkor owned property, engaged in international trade, and even served as bodyguards to the king. This wasn't just progressive for its time, it was revolutionary. The combination of agricultural surplus, strategic trade location, skilled craftsmanship, and inclusive economic participation made Angkor incredibly wealthy. The god kings weren't just rulers of a religious center. They were CEO kings, managing one of Asia's most successful economies. The divine hierarchy that held it all together, but all this wealth and sophistication was held together by something more powerful than economics or engineering. It was sustained by absolute belief in divine authority. Zhou Daguan provides us with a detailed picture of how this god-king system actually functioned in daily life. At the apex of the social pyramid sat the king, believed to be a living incarnation of Hindu or Buddhist deities. Below him stretched a carefully organized hierarchy that extended down to the lowest peasant. In this country there is a hierarchy of ministers, generals, astronomers, and other functionaries, Zhou recorded. Beneath these come all sorts of small employees, differing only in name from our own. What he was describing was a sophisticated bureaucracy that would have been familiar to any Chinese administrator. These officials were all descendants of families honored by the original Jayavarman, who had founded Angkor 500 years earlier. The system created a hereditary aristocracy whose loyalty to the god-king was reinforced by both self-interest and genuine religious belief. Zhou noted that the king had 5 official wives and a harem of 3,000 women. But this wasn't just royal excess, it was political strategy. As one historian explains, it was a practice of the aristocrats and regional landed gentry to send a woman from their family to become a member of the king's entourage, to become a concubine. This would bind the provinces to the center in a very physical manner. In other words, every noble family in the empire had a daughter, sister, or cousin living in the royal palace. This created personal connections between the god-king and every important family throughout his domain. The king was rarely seen outside the palace, making his public appearances all the more significant. Zhou describes one such occasion during the New Year festival. At night, the king comes forth to take part in the spectacle. Rockets are fired that can be seen from 13 kilometers away. Firecrackers loud as swivel guns shake the whole city. These weren't just celebrations, they were demonstrations of divine power. The ability to create fire and thunder was proof that the god-king commanded supernatural forces. The legend that revealed everything. Zhou recorded a legend that every citizen of Angkor believed, and this story reveals the psychological foundation that held the entire civilization together. Of the palace rises a golden tower to the top of which the ruler ascends nightly to sleep. It is commonly believed that in the tower dwells a genie formed like a serpent with 9 heads, which is lord of the entire kingdom. Every night the genie appears in the shape of a woman with whom the sovereign couples. Should the genie fail to appear for a single night, it is a sign that the king's death is at hand. If the king should fail to keep his tryst, disaster is sure to follow. Modern historians might chuckle at this supernatural tale, but it reveals something profound about how the Khmer system worked. This wasn't just folklore. This was the operating system of the entire empire. The people truly believed their king communicated directly with supernatural forces that controlled their prosperity, their harvests, their protection from enemies, and their very survival. If the king lost his divine connection, the kingdom would fall. This belief system had practical implications. It meant that 1 million people were willing to devote enormous labor to building temples, maintaining water systems, and supporting the royal court because they genuinely believed their survival depended on keeping their god-king spiritually powerful. It also meant that if that belief ever cracked, if people began to doubt the king's divinity, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. But this sophisticated paradise had a dark foundation that Zhou Daguan documented with uncomfortable honesty. The economy of Angkor depended heavily on slave labor. Zhou describes these unfortunate souls. Wild men from the hills can be bought to serve as slaves. Families of wealth may own more than 100. Those of lesser means content themselves with 10 or 20. Only the very poor have none. These weren't just servants. They were human property, bought and sold like livestock. Ancient inscriptions reveal that some slaves faced brutal treatment. One record tells of an escaped slave who was recaptured, punished by having his eyes gouged out and his ears cut off. The legal system was equally harsh for all subjects. Zhou recorded, "In very serious cases, a pit is dug outside the city. The criminal is dropped into it, and earth and stones are heaped on top until he is buried alive. Lesser crimes are dealt with by cutting off feet or hands, or by amputating the nose. This wasn't unusual for medieval societies, but it reveals that Angkor's sophistication coexisted with brutal punishments that kept the population in line. The God King's absolute power extended to every aspect of life. Subjects weren't just expected to obey, they were required to worship. Failure to show proper reverence could result in death or mutilation. Even Zhou, representing the powerful Chinese empire, had to prostrate himself before the Khmer king during audiences. The protocol was strict and non-negotiable. Approach slowly, fall to your knees, touch your forehead to the ground, and wait to be acknowledged. This combination of genuine religious belief, economic prosperity, engineering marvels, and absolute terror created a system so stable it lasted for centuries. But it also contained the seeds of its own destruction. For over a century after Mouhot's discovery, archaeologists focused on restoring the magnificent stone temples. But they largely ignored Zhou Daguan's account of a vast, bustling city. How could they prove the existence of something that had been swallowed by jungle centuries ago? Then in 1994, archaeologists convinced NASA to undertake a unique mission. The space agency had developed specialist radar technology that could penetrate thick vegetation. Their challenge? Probe the area around Angkor Wat as the space shuttle Endeavour passed over Southeast Asia. The resulting images were revolutionary. For the first time, scientists had an accurate picture of what lay hidden beneath the jungle canopy. And what they found was beyond their wildest dreams. The radar revealed a vast urban complex covering an area the size of modern London. This rural metropolis was immense, a sophisticated grid of roads, canals, and settlements all connected to the central walled city. Archaeologist Elizabeth Moore called it a major breakthrough. What the radar has shown us is just how all the regions contributed to what became the central zone of Angkor. When you start looking at the imagery and see the sophistication with which they controlled their terrain, I've never seen a culture like it elsewhere in Southeast Asia. The space images revealed previously unknown temples scattered across the Angkorian basin, each at the center of its own village community, just like village churches in medieval Europe. These temples indicated settlements housing between 100 and 300 people each. The number of temple sites discovered runs into the thousands, suggesting a massive population that archaeologists had never imagined possible. As archaeologists studied the NASA images and cross-referenced them with ancient inscriptions, an incredible picture emerged. Sanskrit inscriptions revealed that a single temple, Taprom, housed at least 12,000 people, including priests, dancers, and various temple officials. If one temple supported 12,000 people, what was the overall population of this jungle metropolis? New research suggests the city could have housed between 80,000 and 150,000 people just within the central area. But when you include all the outlying villages connected by roads and canals, the total population may have reached 1 million people. To put this in perspective, at the same time Angkor was thriving with potentially 1 million inhabitants. The population of London totaled no more than 30,000. This makes Angkor, at its peak, between the 11th and 13th centuries, potentially one of the largest cities in the world. 1 million people living in sophisticated harmony, in the heart of what Europeans considered an impenetrable jungle. But here's the mystery that will blow your mind. How did 1 million people survive and prosper in one of the world's most challenging climates? The answer lies in the Khmer's ability to master their most precious resource, water. Cambodia has 8 months without rain when rivers become muddy trickles. Then for a few months, the monsoon brings devastating floods. For most civilizations, this would be impossible to manage. But the Khmer were water management geniuses. They built their city near the Great Lake, which swells to 4 times its size during the rainy season, providing both water throughout the year and an inexhaustible supply of fish. Zhou Daguan recorded the abundance. Of all the fish, the black carp is most abundant. The prawns weigh as much as half a kilo apiece. Crocodiles grow as large as boats, but the real miracle was their irrigation system. The god kings ordered thousands of acres of jungle cleared for rice production, then created an elaborate network of canals, reservoirs, and channels to keep the new fields watered year-round. Recent excavations have revealed just how sophisticated this system was. Jacques Gaucher's surveys uncovered 2 massive reservoirs within the royal city, each measuring 300 meters long and 20 meters wide. But here's the ingenious part. The reservoirs were built at slightly different levels. When a major road needed to cross between them, Khmer engineers didn't just build a bridge. They created narrow channels in a stone dike that allowed water to filter from the upper reservoir to the lower while traffic continued to flow. Above, while the Dutch were experimenting with their first basic canals, the Khmer were already master hydraulic engineers managing water on an unprecedented scale. But this incredible system had a fatal flaw. As Jacques Gaucher discovered during his excavations, the water management was so sophisticated that it became fragile. Playing at such a scale with water management, with such small differences of level, I think the system was quite fragile, Gaucher explains. If there were any variability in the environment, or problems with maintenance or social or political issues, the ultra-sophistication could become a weakness. Think about it. The very engineering marvel that made Angkor possible also made it vulnerable. The system was so finely balanced that it required constant expert maintenance. If anything went wrong, if the king became distracted, if workers rebelled, if knowledge was lost, the entire city could collapse. This wasn't just a city. It was a massive, living machine that required perfect coordination to survive. Zhou Daguan recorded something that reveals just how central the God King was to this system. He wrote about a legend that every citizen of Angkor believed. Of the palace rises a golden tower to the top of which the ruler ascends nightly to sleep. It is commonly believed that in the tower dwells a genie formed like a serpent with 9 heads, which is lord of the entire kingdom. Every night, the genie appears in the shape of a woman with whom the sovereign couples. Should the genie fail to appear for a single night, it is a sign that the king's death is at hand. If the king should fail to keep his tryst, disaster is sure to follow. This wasn't just folklore. This was the belief system that held the entire civilization together. The people truly believed their king was divine, that he communicated directly with supernatural forces, and that their survival depended on his spiritual power. Zhou noted that the king had 5 wives and a harem of 3,000 women. He was rarely seen outside the palace, making his few public appearances during festivals even more significant. At night, the king comes forth to take part in the spectacle. Rockets are fired that can be seen from 13 kilometers away. Firecrackers loud as swivel guns shake the whole city. This wasn't just pageantry. It was proof of divine power that kept 1 million people working in harmony. By the end of the 13th century, when Zhou Daguan completed his stay and returned to China, Angkor appeared to be at its absolute peak. The city was larger and more prosperous than ever before. Trade was booming. The temples were magnificent. The water systems functioned flawlessly. But Zhou's account, when read carefully, contains subtle hints that all was not well in paradise. His descriptions of military capabilities were particularly troubling. Zhou noted with apparent concern, "Recently, during the war with Siam, and whole villages have been laid waste. The emerging Thai kingdom was becoming increasingly aggressive. and the Khmer seemed unprepared for the changing nature of warfare. Zhou observed that the Khmer army was ill-equipped for modern combat. Soldiers move about unclothed, with a lance in the right hand and shield in the left. They have no bows, no missiles, no breastplates, and no helmets. Generally speaking, these people have neither discipline nor strategy. This was a devastating assessment from a representative of the Chinese military tradition. The Khmer were still fighting wars using methods that had worked centuries earlier, but their enemies were adopting new technologies and tactics. The Thais, in particular, were learning from conflicts with other kingdoms and incorporating more sophisticated military strategies. They had better weapons, more disciplined armies, and most importantly, they were unified under strong leadership, while the Khmer Empire was showing signs of internal strain. But military weakness wasn't the only problem. Zhou's account reveals economic stresses that would have been invisible to casual observers, but were deeply troubling to someone familiar with Chinese. Administrative practices, the elaborate court ceremonies and massive building projects that made Angkor impressive were also bleeding the kingdom dry. Zhou noted the enormous number of officials, servants and hangers-on who surrounded the king, all of whom had to be fed, housed and paid from the royal treasury. The God-King system that had once motivated people to extraordinary achievements was becoming a burden. As Buddhist ideas spread among the population, fewer people were willing to devote their entire lives to glorifying an earthly ruler. Jayavarman VII's compassionate Buddhism had created a philosophical contradiction at the heart of the empire. How could a truly enlightened ruler justify demanding that his subjects live in poverty while he resided in golden palaces? How could a bodhisattva devoted to ending suffering maintain a system based on slave labor and brutal punishments? These questions didn't have easy answers, and they began to erode the absolute faith that had held the system together for centuries. The fatal combination of weaknesses modern. Historians and archaeologists have identified multiple factors that combined to destroy this once mighty civilization. Like a perfect storm, each problem made the others worse until the entire system collapsed. Military defeat. In 1431 AD, the Thais finally succeeded in their ultimate goal. They sacked Angkor, looted everything portable, and enslaved much of the population, including the king's entire harem. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered the myth of divine protection. Resource exhaustion. Charles Hyam suggests that Jayavarman VII's building frenzy had exhausted the state's resources. Because of the excesses of Jayavarman VII, who clearly was a builder with a frenzy of activity, he may well have exhausted the resources of the state, and it went into decline. Think about the scale of what Jayavarman VII had attempted. In less than 40 years, he had moved more stone than all previous kings combined, built over 100 hospitals, constructed roads across the entire empire, and maintained a military capable of defending borders that stretched across most of mainland Southeast Asia. This level of activity required enormous human and material resources. Every stone block had to be quarried, transported, and carved by human labor. Every road required thousands of workers to clear jungle, level terrain, and build bridges. Every hospital needed staff, supplies, and ongoing maintenance. The kingdom may simply have reached the limits of what was sustainable, given the technology and population of the time. Religious transformation. Jayavarman VII's conversion to Buddhism created a spiritual crisis that undermined the foundations of royal authority. Buddhism's emphasis on reducing attachment to material things directly contradicted the accumulation of wealth and power that kept the empire functioning. As Buddhist ideals spread among the population, people began questioning whether building massive stone temples was really more important than feeding the hungry or caring for the sick. If the king was truly enlightened, why did he need golden palaces and thousands of servants? The absolute faith in divine kingship that had motivated people to extraordinary sacrifices began to erode. Without that faith, the God-King system couldn't function. Ecological disaster, perhaps most importantly, the Khmer may have destroyed the environmental foundations of their own prosperity. The massive scale of rice agriculture required clearing enormous areas of forest. Deforestation around Angkor was so extensive that it began to affect local weather patterns. Without forest cover to retain moisture and prevent erosion, the landscape became more vulnerable to both drought and flooding. Christophe Potier believes this was a critical factor. At the end, pieces of the forest should have been very, very rare. Deforestation is an issue. It's not a new problem. It's an old one. As forests disappeared, rivers and canals began to silt up more rapidly. The ultra-sophisticated water management system that had made Angkor possible became increasingly difficult to maintain. Technological stagnation. While other civilizations were developing new technologies and adapting to changing conditions, the Khmer had become locked into systems that worked but couldn't evolve. Their stone construction techniques were magnificent but inflexible. Their water management was sophisticated but fragile. Their military tactics were traditional but obsolete. Success had made them conservative, and conservatism made them vulnerable to more adaptive neighbors. Jacques Gaucher's analysis of the water management system reveals the fundamental paradox that destroyed Angkor. Playing at such a scale with water management, with such small differences of level, I think the system was quite fragile. If there were any variability in the environment, or problems with maintenance, or social or political issues, the ultra-sophistication could become a weakness. This insight applies to more than just hydraulic engineering. The entire Angkorian system had become so sophisticated, so finely tuned, so dependent on perfect coordination that it couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. When everything worked perfectly, when the rains came on schedule, when enemies stayed weak, when the population remained absolutely loyal, when the king maintained divine authority, Angkor was the most successful city on earth. But when any element of this perfect system began to fail, the whole structure became vulnerable. The god kings had created a civilization that was, in a sense, too perfect to survive in an imperfect world. The decision to abandon Angkor wasn't sudden. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a gradual process that took place over several decades in the 15th century. As Thai attacks intensified and internal problems mounted, the remaining Khmer court began relocating important functions to more defensible positions. The capital gradually shifted eastward, closer to the Mekong River and farther from Thai territory. The final abandonment of Angkor Thom probably occurred around 1431 AD, after the decisive Thai victory. But this wasn't the collapse of Khmer civilization. It was a strategic retreat that saved what could be saved. As Charles Heim explains, we're not talking about the actual collapse and total demise of a civilization. What happened was that they moved sensibly to the east, down to the Mekong River and away from the Thais. The court re-established itself near present-day Phnom Penh, where it could control river trade and remain connected to the outside world, while avoiding the massive maintenance costs of the Angkor infrastructure. Now completely Buddhist, and having learned hard lessons about the dangers of imperial overstretch, the Khmer would never again attempt to build anything approaching the scale of Angkor. The move made practical sense, but it meant abandoning the most magnificent city in Southeast Asian history to the jungle that had been held back for 6 centuries. Within a few decades, tropical vegetation began reclaiming the temples, palaces, and canals. Trees grew through roofs, vines covered walls, and the forest slowly swallowed what had once been home to 1 million people. For 400 years, Angkor lay hidden, known only to a few Buddhist monks who maintained basic rituals at some of the temples and local villages who had oral traditions about the old city in the forest. When Henri Mouhot rediscovered Angkor in 1860, he asked the question that still resonates today: What has become of this powerful race, so civilized and enlightened, to create these gigantic works? The answer, as we now understand it, offers sobering lessons for any civilization. Angkor succeeded because it solved fundamental human challenges: how to feed large populations, how to organize complex societies, how to create beauty and meaning in daily life. The Khmer achieved things that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. But Angkor failed because its very success made it inflexible. The systems that created prosperity became prisons that prevented adaptation. The beliefs that motivated achievement became dogmas that couldn't evolve. Most importantly, Angkor failed because its leaders confused magnificence with sustainability. Building bigger temples didn't make the kingdom stronger, it made it more vulnerable. In our modern world of global cities and advanced technology, the parallels are troubling. Like Angkor, our civilization depends on complex systems that most people don't understand. Like the Khmer, we've created infrastructure that requires constant expert maintenance. Like the God Kings, our leaders sometimes confuse impressive projects with lasting achievements. The ruins of Angkor remind us that even the most sophisticated civilizations are fragile. Success doesn't guarantee survival. And sometimes, the very things that make a society great can become the things that destroy it. But Angkor's story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's also an inspiration. For over 6 centuries, the Khmer proved that humans can create something approaching paradise on Earth. They showed that different cultures can live together in prosperity. They demonstrated that with sufficient organization and determination, even the most challenging environments can be transformed into gardens. Today, as archaeologists continue to reveal Angkor's secrets, we're not just learning about the past, we're discovering possibilities for the future. The Khmer solved problems we're still working on: sustainable agriculture, water management, urban planning, cultural integration. Their solutions weren't perfect, but they worked for longer than most civilizations dream of lasting. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Angkor is that human achievement has no limits except those we impose on ourselves. The Khmer built one of the greatest cities in history using nothing but human labor, natural materials, and an unshakable belief that the impossible was merely difficult. In the ruins of their temples, we can still see the reflection of that ancient ambition, and perhaps find inspiration for our own